On our anniversary dinner, the chef came out personally and said, "I need you to leave now." My wife Amanda and I were celebrating 15 years of marriage at Meridian, the kind of restaurant where reservations required 3 months advance notice and a single entree cost more than our first date entire evening. I'd saved for 6 months to afford this night, working overtime at the accounting firm, skipping lunches, anything to give Amanda the anniversary she deserved after years of my promising we'd do something special and never following through. She looked beautiful across the candlelit table, wearing the emerald dress I'd bought her last Christmas, her auburn hair catching the warm light in a way that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with her at 23. We'd just finished our appetizers when Chef Antoine Rousseau emerged from the kitchen, a tall man in his 50s with sharp features and an expression I couldn't immediately read. He walked directly to our table, ignoring the other diners, and leaned down close enough that only we could hear. "Mr. Garrett, I need you and your wife to leave this restaurant immediately. Don't ask questions. Don't make a scene. Just get up and walk out the front door right now." His French accent was thick with urgency, his hand gripping the edge of our table hard enough that his knuckles went white. I stared at him, completely confused, wondering if this was some bizarre Michelin star restaurant custom I didn't understand. Amanda's face had gone pale, her wine glass frozen halfway to her lips. "I'm sorry, what?" I managed to say, keeping my voice low because other diners were starting to notice the chef standing at our table. "Did we do something wrong? Is there a problem with our reservation?" Chef Rousseau's eyes darted toward the kitchen, then back to us, and I saw something in his expression that made my stomach drop. It was fear. Raw, genuine fear from a man who commanded one of the most prestigious kitchens in the city. "Please," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "I cannot explain right now, but you need to trust me. Leave through the front entrance, get in your car, and drive away. Do not go home tonight. Stay somewhere public, somewhere with many people." He straightened up, his professional mask sliding back into place as he raised his voice slightly. "I apologize, but there has been an issue with the kitchen tonight. We must close early for health and safety reasons. Your meal will be fully refunded." He said this last part loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. Amanda set down her wine glass carefully, her hand shaking. "Antoine, what's happening?" she asked, and I realized with a jolt that she'd used his first name. The chef's eyes flickered to her, and something passed between them that I didn't understand, some unspoken communication that excluded me completely. "Amanda, please," he said quietly. "Trust me one more time. Leave now. One more time." The phrase echoed in my head as I tried to process what was happening. How did my wife know this chef well enough to call him by his first name? Why was he begging us to leave his restaurant in the middle of our anniversary dinner? And why did Amanda look terrified rather than confused? I stood up slowly, pulling out my wallet, but Chef Rousseau waved me off. "No payment. Just go." His eyes kept darting toward the kitchen entrance, toward something or someone I couldn't see. Other diners were murmuring now, clearly upset about their expensive meals being interrupted. A manager appeared, a polished woman in her 30s who began apologizing profusely to nearby tables about the unexpected closure. Amanda grabbed her purse and stood, her movements mechanical, like she was operating on autopilot. I took her arm and we walked toward the front entrance, my mind spinning with questions I couldn't articulate. As we passed the host stand, I glanced back and saw Chef Rousseau still standing by our table, watching us leave with an expression of intense relief. Then I saw something else. Through the round window of the kitchen door, I caught a glimpse of a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, maybe 6'4", with a shaved head and a neck tattoo visible above his chef's coat collar. He was staring directly at me through that window, and the look on his face was pure hatred. Not the general anger of a disgruntled employee, but specific, targeted malice directed at me personally. I'd never seen this man before in my life, but he looked at me like he wanted me dead. The valet brought our car around, and I tipped him automatically, my hands moving through familiar motions while my brain tried to catch up to what had just happened. Amanda slid into the passenger seat without a word, staring straight ahead through the windshield. I got in the driver's seat and just sat there for a moment, engine running, not knowing where to go or what to do. Finally, I turned to my wife and asked the question that was burning through my confusion. "How do you know, Chef Rousseau?" Amanda's jaw tightened. She didn't look at me, just kept staring forward, her hands clasped together in her lap, so tightly, her knuckles were white. "Drive," she said quietly. "Just drive somewhere public like he said. We can talk there." I pulled out of the parking lot, heading toward the shopping district downtown where restaurants and bars would be crowded on a Friday night. My mind was racing through possibilities, trying to find an innocent explanation for why my wife was on a first-name basis with a celebrity chef I'd never heard her mention before, why he'd urgently evacuated us from his restaurant, why that man in the kitchen had looked at me with such concentrated hatred. Every explanation I constructed fell apart under the weight of Amanda's obvious fear. She knew something. She understood what was happening in a way I didn't, and that realization felt like falling. I parked outside a busy chain restaurant, the kind of place that was the complete opposite of Meridian's refined elegance. All bright lights and families with screaming children and absolutely zero privacy. which was apparently the point, based on Chef Rousseau's instructions to stay somewhere public. We sat in the car for a long moment, the engine ticking as it cooled, neither of us moving. "Amanda," I said finally, "you need to tell me what the hell is going on, right now." She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, I saw tears tracking down her cheeks, ruining the careful makeup she'd applied for our anniversary dinner. "His name is Derek Vance," she said quietly. "He's my ex-boyfriend from college, and he's been in prison for the last 12 years. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Okay, and why does that matter to us right now?" Amanda turned to look at me, and the expression on her face made my heart rate spike. "He went to prison for attempted murder, Nathan. He tried to kill me." The words hung in the air between us like something physical, something I could almost reach out and touch. I'd known Amanda since we were 22, had dated her for 3 years before proposing, had been married for 15 years. In all that time, she'd never mentioned an ex-boyfriend who'd tried to kill her, never mentioned being the victim of attempted murder, never mentioned any of this history that was apparently threatening us right now. "What?" I managed to say, my voice coming out strangled. "Amanda, what are you talking about? How have you never told me this?" She was crying harder now, her whole body shaking. "I was 20 years old. It happened right before I met you. Derek and I dated for 2 years in college, and at first he seemed perfect. Charming, attentive, ambitious. Then he started getting possessive. Jealous. He'd accuse me of cheating whenever I talked to other guys, even professors or study group members. He'd show up at my dorm uninvited, go through my phone, demand to know where I was every minute. When I tried to break up with him, he lost it completely." She paused, wiping at her tears with shaking hands. "He showed up at my apartment one night, drunk and high on something. Cocaine, the police said later. He had a knife. He said if he couldn't have me, no one could, all the typical stalker ex-boyfriend crap you hear about but never think will happen to you. He stabbed me 3 times before my roommate came home and scared him off. I spent 2 weeks in the hospital. He got 15 years for attempted murder and aggravated assault. I felt like I was going to throw up. My wife had nearly been murdered and I'd never known. Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, hearing the hurt in my own voice and hating it because this wasn't about me. This was about her trauma, but I couldn't stop the question from coming out. Amanda looked at me with red, swollen eyes. "Because I wanted to move on, Nathan. I did years of therapy. I changed schools, changed my whole life. When I met you 6 months later, I was finally starting to feel normal again. You were sweet and safe and nothing like Derek. I didn't want my past to define me. I didn't want you to see me as a victim. And as time went on, it became harder and harder to bring it up. How do you tell your boyfriend of 1 year or 2 years, or your fiancé or your husband, that you forgot to mention you were almost murdered? I wanted to be angry, to feel betrayed by this massive secret she'd kept from me for our entire relationship, but looking at her face, I saw only terror and shame. "Okay," I said, forcing my voice to stay calm. "Okay, so Derek got 15 years. That means he's been in prison for 12 years. He's not supposed to get out for 3 more years, right?" Amanda shook her head. "Good behavior. Overcrowding? I don't know the details. My victim advocate coordinator was supposed to notify me when his release date approached, but I haven't heard from that office in years. I assumed everything was still on track. I stopped checking obsessively after we got married, after we had the kids. I let myself believe I was safe. We had 2 children, Emma and Sophie, currently staying with Amanda's parents for the weekend, so we could have our anniversary to ourselves. The thought of Derek Vance anywhere near our daughters made my blood run cold. And somehow, he's working in Chef Rousseau's kitchen? I asked, trying to piece together the connections. How does Antoine know about Derek? How did he recognize him? Amanda's face crumpled again. Antoine and I dated briefly, about 8 months after Derek went to prison. Nothing serious, just a few months, but I told him everything about Derek because I was still processing the trauma. We stayed friends after we broke up. He was just starting his career as a chef back then. Suddenly, Chef Rousseau's behavior made horrible sense. He'd recognized Derek Vance in his kitchen, probably from seeing his face during Amanda's recovery all those years ago, and had immediately understood the danger. He'd rushed out to warn us before Derek could do whatever he'd been planning. "We need to call the police," I said, already pulling out my phone. "Right now. Derek's on parole. He's not supposed to be anywhere near you. There has to be a restraining order." Amanda grabbed my wrist. "Nathan, wait. Think about this. If we call the police right now, what happens? They go to the restaurant to find Derek and he what? Runs? Disappears? We don't even know if he's still there. And even if they catch him, what do they charge him with? Working at a restaurant where his victim's husband happened to make a reservation. He hasn't violated the restraining order yet because he didn't approach me. He might get sent back to prison for parole violation eventually, but not tonight, not immediately." She was right, and I hated it. "So, what do we do?" I asked, feeling helpless and furious. Amanda pulled out her own phone with trembling hands. "I call my victim coordinator. I find out why I wasn't notified about his release. We document everything, start a paper trail, and we figure out if this was coincidence or if Derek somehow knew we'd be there tonight. The second possibility hit me like ice water. Our reservation had been made 3 months ago under my name. Meridian's reservation system was probably computerized, accessible to staff. If Derek had been working there for any length of time, he could have seen our reservation, connected my last name to Amanda's married name, realized his ex-girlfriend would be walking into his workplace on a specific date and time. This might not have been a coincidence at all. This might have been a carefully planned ambush that only failed because Chef Rousseau had recognized Derek and intervened. Amanda was already on the phone with someone, her voice shaking as she explained the situation. I got out of the car and paced the parking lot, needing to move, needing to do something with the adrenaline flooding my system. A family walked past me into the restaurant, parents and 3 kids, completely oblivious to the crisis unfolding in the parking lot. Normal people having a normal Friday night, the kind of night Amanda and I were supposed to be having. Instead, we were hiding from a violent ex-boyfriend who'd somehow found us 15 years after nearly murdering my wife. My phone rang, and I answered without checking the caller ID. "Nathan, it's Antoine." Chef Rousseau's voice was tight with stress. "Is Amanda okay? Are you somewhere safe?" "We're fine," I said, though fine seemed like a grotesque mischaracterization. "We're at a public place like you said. What happened after we left?" There was a long pause, and I heard kitchen noise in the background, metal clanging, people shouting orders. "Derek realized I'd warned you," Antoine said finally. "He confronted me in the kitchen, accused me of betraying him, said I'd ruined everything he'd been planning for months. My sous chef had to physically restrain him while I called the police. They arrived 10 minutes ago and arrested him for violating parole by threatening me. He's in custody right now." Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. "He said he'd been planning something for months?" Antoine's voice dropped lower. "Nathan, I didn't realize it was him when I hired him 6 weeks ago. He applied under his mother's maiden name, had decent references that I didn't check thoroughly enough because we were desperate for line cooks. I only recognized him tonight because he took his hat off and I saw his face fully for the first time. He looks different from his mugshot. Older, harder, but I remembered the tattoo on his neck. The same one from the police photos Amanda showed me years ago. A scorpion. Very distinctive. I remembered seeing that tattoo through the kitchen window, the way Derek had stared at me with such concentrated hatred. What was he planning? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Antoine exhaled shakily. He had a knife, Nathan. Not a kitchen knife, a hunting knife, in his personal locker. And he had photographs. Printed photographs of Amanda. Recent ones. Taken outside your house, at the grocery store, at your daughter's school. He's been stalking her. The police are treating this as a credible threat of violence. They're searching his apartment now for additional evidence. My legs went weak, and I leaned against our car for support. Derek Vance had been watching my wife, watching my children for God knows how long. Planning something terrible, biding his time until the perfect opportunity presented itself. If Chef Rousseau hadn't recognized him, if he hadn't rushed out to warn us, Amanda and I would still be sitting at that table when Derek emerged from the kitchen with a knife. We might both be dead right now. Our daughters would be orphans. The thought made me physically ill. Amanda emerged from the car, still on her phone, gesturing for me to come back. I thanked Antoine and promised to be in touch, then returned to my wife, who was now talking to what sounded like a police detective. She was explaining our history with Derek, the attempted murder conviction, the fact that she'd never been notified of his release from prison. Her voice had steadied, moving from terrified to angry, and I recognized the tone. This was Amanda in professional mode, the voice she used when dealing with incompetent contractors or school administrators who wouldn't listen. She was taking control of the situation because that's what she did when the world tried to push her around. It was one of the things I loved most about her, her refusal to be a victim even when circumstances tried to make her one. The detective apparently wanted us to come to the station to give formal statements, and Amanda agreed immediately. We drove there in silence, both processing what had just happened, what almost happened, what had been happening without our knowledge for weeks or months. The police station was bright and sterile, smelling of industrial cleaner and bad coffee. A detective named Kayla Rosenberg met us in the lobby, a woman in her 40s with short gray hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. She led us to an interview room, and we spent the next 3 hours going over everything. Amanda's history with Derek, the attempted murder, the conviction, the prison sentence, tonight's events at the restaurant. Detective Rosenberg took detailed notes and occasionally left to confer with other officers. She returned with updates that made the situation progressively more disturbing. Derek had been released 8 months ago, not 3 weeks ago, like Amanda's victim coordinator had claimed when she'd finally gotten through to someone at that office. 8 months of freedom that Amanda should have been warned about. 8 months where Derek could have been planning and preparing and stalking the victim. Notification system had catastrophically failed, and someone at that office would have to answer for why Amanda had never received the automated alerts she was legally entitled to. Derek's apartment had been searched, and police found detailed plans for what he'd intended to do. A timeline written in a notebook describing his release from prison, his anger at Amanda for ruining his life with her testimony at trial, his obsession with making her suffer the way he'd suffered. He'd researched our lives extensively, knew where we lived, where we worked, where our daughters went to school. He'd applied for jobs at multiple restaurants Amanda and I had previously visited, hoping to encounter us by chance, landing a position at Meridian, where he'd discovered our anniversary reservation in the system. must have felt like divine providence to his twisted mind. Detective Rosenberg showed us printouts of some of Derek's writings, and they were chilling. He blamed Amanda for his incarceration, for the years he'd lost, for his inability to maintain relationships or find decent employment with a felony record. He'd convinced himself that he'd been the victim all along, that Amanda had somehow seduced him into violence and then cruelly had him imprisoned for it. The mental gymnastics required to reach that conclusion were staggering, but Derek had spent over a decade in prison nursing his grievances and building a narrative where he was justified in seeking revenge. He'd planned to attack us during our anniversary dinner, to make Amanda watch him kill me before turning the knife on her, his final act of revenge for the life he believed she'd stolen from him. Only Chef Rousseau's intervention had prevented this fantasy from becoming reality. The photographs police found in Derek's apartment were worse than Antoine had described. Hundreds of images taken over months, documenting Amanda's daily routines with obsessive detail. Timestamps and locations written on the backs in Derek's handwriting. Pictures of our daughters playing in the front yard, getting on the school bus, the kind of surveillance that suggested he'd been preparing for multiple possible scenarios. Detective Rosenberg assured us that Derek would be charged with stalking, making terroristic threats, parole violations, and attempted murder based on the evidence of his clear intent. He wasn't getting out this time. We left the police station after midnight, exhausted and traumatized, heading not to our house, but to Amanda's parents' place where our daughters were sleeping. I couldn't bear the thought of going home knowing Derek had been watching our house, photographing our family, planning violence in those spaces we believed were safe. Amanda's mother opened the door in her bathrobe, took one look at our faces, and ushered us inside without questions. We sat at her kitchen table and explained everything in whispered voices, while Emma and Sophie slept upstairs, oblivious to how close they'd come to losing both parents tonight. Amanda's mother cried quietly, her hand over her mouth, as the story unfolded. Her father paced the kitchen, getting increasingly angry about the system failures that had allowed Derek to stalk Amanda undetected. The victim notification system that hadn't notified, the parole board that had released a violent offender early, the background check process that had missed Derek's criminal record because he'd used his mother's name, every institutional failure that had nearly cost us our lives. Amanda's father wanted to sue everyone involved, wanted accountability from every person and agency that had failed to protect his daughter. I understood the impulse, but all I felt was exhausted. Exhausted and grateful that we were alive, that Chef Rousseau had recognized Derek, that we'd left when we did. The legal process that followed was lengthy and infuriating. Derek was charged with multiple felonies, but his defense attorney tried to argue that thoughts and plans weren't crimes, that possessing photographs wasn't illegal, that Derek had never actually approached or threatened Amanda. The prosecutor, a determined woman named Lisa Thornton, systematically destroyed these arguments. She introduced Derek's written plans as evidence of premeditated intent. She brought in expert testimony about stalking behavior and escalation patterns. She presented the hunting knife and the photographs, and Derek's own words expressing his desire to make Amanda suffer. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and Amanda had to testify about the original attempted murder from 15 years ago, as well as the recent stalking. Sitting in that courtroom, watching my wife describe being stabbed by someone who claimed to love her was one of the hardest experiences of my life. Derek sat at the defense table looking almost bored, occasionally smirking when Amanda's voice broke during testimony. His attorney kept trying to paint him as a troubled man who'd served his time and simply wanted to rebuild his life, who'd made poor choices but hadn't actually committed any new violence. The jury saw through it completely. Chef Antoine Rousseau testified about recognizing Derek and the confrontation in the kitchen after we'd left. He was professional and clear, describing Derek's threatening behavior and explicit statements about having planned to attack us during dinner. The sous chef who'd restrained Derek corroborated every detail. Meridian's reservation system records proved Derek had access to our information and would have seen our anniversary booking weeks in advance. The prosecution built an overwhelming case demonstrating premeditation, stalking, and clear intent to commit violence. The defense had nothing substantial to counter with except Derek's insistence that he'd never intended to hurt anyone, that the knife was for protection, that the photographs were taken from public spaces and therefore legal. His testimony was his biggest mistake. On the IE stand, Derek became defensive and angry, his mask of wounded innocence slipping to reveal the rage underneath. When the prosecutor asked why he'd written detailed descriptions of killing me and Amanda, Derek snapped that they were just fantasies, ways to cope with his anger, that he had a right to his thoughts. When asked why he'd needed a hunting knife in his work locker, he claimed he'd been planning a camping trip, though he couldn't name where or with whom. The jury looked disgusted. The verdict came back in less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts: stalking, terroristic threats, violating a restraining order, parole violations, and attempted murder based on his clear planning and intent. The judge scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later, and we spent that time trying to return to some semblance of normal life, while knowing Derek was locked up awaiting his fate. Emma and Sophie knew something had happened. That Daddy and Mommy had missed their anniversary dinner and now police were sometimes parked outside our house, but we'd protected them from the details. They were 9 and 11, too young to understand the full horror of what their mother had survived twice now. At the sentencing hearing, Amanda gave a victim impact statement that left half the courtroom in tears. She described the 15-year-old trauma that had shaped her life, the therapy and nightmares and hypervigilance that had never fully gone away. She described the terror of learning Derek had been stalking her family for months without her knowledge, the violation of discovering he'd photographed her children, the knowledge that only chance and Chef Rousseau's recognition had prevented another violent attack. She looked directly at Derek while she spoke, her voice strong and clear, refusing to let him see her fear anymore. The judge sentenced Derek to 35 years in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. She called his actions a calculated campaign of terror against a woman who had already survived his violence once, and noted that the threat he posed to Amanda and our family was ongoing and severe. She referenced the system failures that had allowed him to stalk Amanda without warning, stating that this sentence needed to reflect not just his actions, but the need to protect society from someone who had proven twice that he would pursue revenge against a woman who dared to survive him. Derek's face remained expressionless as the sentence was read, but his hands clenched into fists on the defense table. He was 42 years old. By the time he was eligible for parole, he'd be 67, his life effectively over. As they led him away in shackles, he turned and looked at Amanda one last time, and whatever he saw in her face must have disappointed him because his expression crumpled into impotent rage before the bailiff pushed him through the door. We went home that night and slept in our own bed for the first time in weeks. The house, feeling safer than it had since the anniversary dinner that had turned into a nightmare. The girls were happy to have us back to normal, though their version of normal now included security cameras and a monitored alarm system, and a German shepherd named Atlas we'd adopted from a police dog training program. The civil lawsuits came later, directed at the victim notification system that had catastrophically failed Amanda and at the parole board that had released Derek early without proper evaluation. Our attorney, a fierce advocate named Richard Kemp, argued that these institutional failures had directly endangered Amanda's life and our family's safety. The cases settled out of court for amounts we weren't allowed to disclose, but the real victory was the policy changes implemented as part of the settlement. The state revamped its victim notification system, implementing multiple redundancies to ensure victims would actually receive timely warnings about their attacker's release. The parole board instituted new evaluation protocols for violent offenders, particularly those convicted of crimes against specific individuals. These changes wouldn't undo what had happened to us, but they might prevent future victims from facing the same nightmare. Chef Antoine Rousseau became an unexpected friend through all of this. He'd testified at Derek's trial, had closed his restaurant for a full day to ensure his staff was interviewed by police, had cooperated fully even when it meant admitting he'd failed to properly screen an employee. He felt tremendous guilt about having unknowingly hired Derek, about putting Amanda in danger through his oversight. We had dinner at Meridian 6 months after the trial, a deliberately symbolic act of reclaiming the anniversary we'd been denied. Antoine refused to let us pay, personally prepared every course, and joined us for coffee afterward. He and Amanda talked about the trauma of that night, about forgiveness and moving forward, about how Derek's evil had been thwarted by Antoine's recognition and quick action. I see his face sometimes, Antoine admitted quietly. In my kitchen, looking through that window with such hatred. I almost didn't trust my recognition. I almost convinced myself I was mistaken. If I doubted what I saw, he didn't finish the sentence. Amanda reached across the table and squeezed his hand. But you didn't doubt, she said firmly. You trusted your instincts, and you saved our lives. I will never forget that, Antoine. Never. He nodded, blinking back tears, and I felt grateful beyond words for this man who'd acted when it mattered most. The psychological aftermath was harder than the legal process. Amanda's PTSD, which she'd managed successfully for years, came roaring back with a vengeance. She couldn't sleep without medication, couldn't go to the grocery store without scanning for threats, couldn't drop the girls at school without panic attacks about their safety. She went back to, therapy twice a week, working with a trauma specialist to process this second victimization. I attended sessions with her sometimes, learning how to support someone recovering from this kind of violation, how to distinguish between reasonable caution and paranoia, how to help her feel safe again in a world that had proven definitively unsafe. Emma and Sophie eventually learned age-appropriate versions of what had happened, mostly because other kids at school had heard rumors and asked questions. We sat them down together and explained that a bad man from Mommy's past had tried to hurt our family, but the police had stopped him, and he was in prison forever now. They had questions we answered as honestly as we could without traumatizing them. They wanted to know if the bad man could escape prison, if he could come back, if they were safe. We assured them that Derek was never getting out, that we had security systems and Atlas the dog and each other. Sophie, our 11-year-old, asked why the bad man had wanted to hurt Mommy in the first place. Amanda took a deep breath and gave an answer that broke my heart. Sometimes people can't handle when someone they care about wants to leave them. Instead of accepting it and moving on, they get angry and want to hurt that person. What the bad man did wasn't about me at all. It was about his own problems, his own inability to control his anger and accept rejection. Emma, 9 years old and fiercely protective, declared that if anyone ever tried to hurt Mommy again, she'd kick them in the shins and call the police immediately. We didn't have the heart to tell her that violence often happens too fast for either response. Life gradually returned to something resembling normal, though our definition of normal had permanently shifted. We installed security cameras, upgraded our locks, took self-defense classes as a family. Amanda started volunteering with a domestic violence organization, using her experience to help other survivors navigate the legal system and the trauma recovery process. She became an advocate for victim notification reform, testifying before state legislators about the failures that had nearly cost her life. Her work gave her purpose and transformed her trauma into tangible help for others facing similar nightmares. I went back to my accounting job but found it harder to care about spreadsheets and tax codes after nearly losing everything that mattered. I started volunteering too, teaching financial literacy to domestic violence survivors trying to rebuild their lives after leaving abusive relationships. The work felt meaningful in a way my day job never had. Our marriage, paradoxically, grew stronger after Derek's arrest and trial. Facing a life-threatening situation together, navigating trauma recovery as a team, stripped away the minor irritations and petty disagreements that had sometimes plagued us. We'd looked directly at the possibility of losing each other and recognized how precious our time together was. We didn't sweat the small stuff anymore. The anniversary dinners we celebrated afterward were always at home, carefully prepared meals shared with our daughters, and sometimes with Antoine, who became an honorary uncle to Emma and Sophie. We never went back to expensive restaurants on our anniversary. The tradition felt tainted, connected to too much fear and too much pain. On our 20th anniversary, 5 years after that terrible night at Meridian, Amanda and I sat in our backyard watching the girls play with Atlas while we grilled burgers and drank beer. It wasn't fancy or romantic in the traditional sense, but it was safe, and it was ours, and it was enough. Do you ever think about what would have happened if Antoine hadn't recognized Derek? Amanda asked quietly, watching Sophie throw a tennis ball for Atlas. I considered lying, considered saying no to spare her the darkness of that thought, but we didn't lie to each other anymore. Every day, I admitted. I think about it every single day. How close we came. How easily it could have gone differently. She nodded, unsurprised. Me too. Sometimes I dream about it. About being back in that restaurant. About Derek coming out of the kitchen with a knife. But then I wake up, and you're here, and the girls are safe, and Derek is in prison forever. We survived, Nathan. Both times, I survived. And that has to mean something. She was right. Survival had to mean something. Had to be more than just luck or Antoine's quick recognition or the various ways the universe had lined up to save us. We'd built lives worth protecting. Raised daughters who would grow up knowing their mother was strong enough to survive 2 attempts on her life. Created a home that felt safe, despite everything that had tried to destroy it. Derek Vance had tried twice to take everything from Amanda and had failed both times. That failure, that absolute defeat of his murderous intentions, was the only justice that mattered. 5 years became 10, and Derek remained in prison where he belonged. Amanda's victim coordinator, a new person in that role after the office had been completely restructured, sent annual updates confirming his continued incarceration and noting that his behavior in prison had been poor enough to eliminate any chance of early release. He'd assaulted another inmate and been placed in solitary confinement multiple times. Whatever capacity for redemption or rehabilitation Derek might have once possessed had long since died, leaving only rage and resentment. The girls grew into teenagers, then young adults, carrying the knowledge of their mother's past, but not burdened by it. Emma studied criminal justice in college, inspired by the detectives and prosecutors who'd protected her family. Sophie became a therapist, wanting to help people heal from trauma the way her mother had. Both of them were strong, confident, unafraid, because they'd grown up watching Amanda refuse to let violence define her. Amanda and I celebrated our 25th anniversary at home again, a tradition now, surrounded by the people we loved in the space we'd built together. Chef Antoine was there, older now and retired from his restaurant, but still someone we considered family. He'd never married, never had children of his own, but he doted on Emma and Sophie like they were his nieces. And sometimes, in quiet moments, I thought about that night and how quickly everything can change, how a single observation from the right person at the right time can mean the difference between life and death. 10 years after the trial, Amanda received a letter forwarded through her victim coordinator. Derek had died in prison, a heart attack at 52 years old, alone in a cell, his body found hours after he'd collapsed. The notification was required by law, giving Amanda official closure that her attacker was gone forever. She read the letter twice, standing in our kitchen, then folded it carefully and put it in the file cabinet where we kept important documents. "How do you feel?" I asked, because I genuinely didn't know if this news would bring relief or grief or something more complicated. Amanda thought about it for a long moment. "Free," she said finally. "For the first time since I was 20 years old, I feel completely free. He can't hurt me anymore. He can't plan or plot or hate me from a distance. He's just gone." That night, We went out to dinner at a nice restaurant, not Meridian, which had closed years ago, but somewhere new and elegant where we could celebrate this unexpected gift of permanent safety. The chef didn't know us, didn't come out to warn us about anything, because there was nothing left to warn us about. We ate our meal in peace. We clinked our wine glasses together, and we went home to the life we'd built despite Derek Vance's best efforts to destroy it. Sometimes surviving is the best revenge. Sometimes living well, raising good humans, finding joy despite trauma, is the ultimate victory over those who tried to break you. Amanda had survived twice and built a beautiful life both times. That was her triumph, her proof that violence doesn't get the final word. Love does, family does, the stubborn refusal to let evil win does. And on that anniversary night, finally free, we celebrated everything we'd fought to keep. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.